Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in a couple minutes as people are starting to roll in. But thank you all for joining us. And for those of you who have joined already, if you want to, feel free to drop in the chat your organization or SEA or LEA name so we can know who's here with us today. And again, we're going to get started probably in just one more minute, just to give other folks a chance to log in. Yes, Tina, we will share a recording of this webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck from today. Okay, well, I feel like we have a lot to cover today, some exciting research to dig into, so we will go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rivet Education's October Professional Learning Power Hour. I'm Annie Morrison, one of Rivet's co-founders, and we'll be joined today with our team here at that you see here with the Center for Public Research and Leadership at Columbia University. But before I do some specific introductions, just wanted to cover some quick housekeeping rules. You all will see that there's a Q&A box in the nav bar at the bottom of your screen. We're going to dig into a bunch of research. We're going to dig into a bunch of recommendations throughout today's call. And so if you guys, it's natural questions are just going to come up, and we're going to pause a couple different times in our call today to answer those questions. And so just go ahead and drop those in that Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them when we do take a break. And then as always, just make sure your cell phone or computer is muted. And then we'll just jump in. So, let me go back one. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time for a Professional Learning Power Hour, just wanted to kind of share a little bit of context about what these are. So Rivet Education hosts these webinars on the third Thursday of every single month, and they are designed to take the research or guidance that we talk about in our monthly blog posts that we put out on the first Thursday of every month and really put that into practice for our guests. So whether we're in today digesting a bunch of research, this will give us a chance to dig into it and what does that mean for the field, right? What does that mean for the PL providers who are joining us today, the SEA leaders who are joining us today, or district leaders joining us. And so our blog posts, again, go out on the first Thursday. They digest a bunch of research or best practices around curriculum-based professional learning. And then we use our time here in these PL Power Hours to then put it into practice for you all. What does that mean in your everyday life? And so again, we hope that you guys will continue to join us every single month for these Power Hours and learn a little bit with us. So again, as I mentioned, I am Annie Morrison with Rivet Education. At Rivet, our vision is really that every educator receives the best resources and support that is available to them in order to provide students with educational opportunities that they need, want, and deserve. And we contribute to that vision by defining high-quality curriculum-based professional learning and then creating the tools and services that support both state and local education agencies and putting that definition into practice for teachers and leaders. And I am joined today, again, by the Center for Public Research and Leadership. We're really excited to have them join us today. And so we're specifically joined by Elizabeth Chu, the Executive Director, Grace McCarty, the Associate Director of Research Strategy and Policy, and Molly Greer-Gurney, the Senior Director of Legal Strategy and Policy. And we had the CPRL team join us today because they have recently put out some really exciting research about the field of curriculum-based professional learning. So here at Rivet, we are totally geeking out on this. This stays on my desk at all times. I refer to it at least once a day. So I'm hoping that you all have read it because you're joining us today, but if you haven't, you should definitely dig into this report. And of course, they're going to share some insights from that today. But it's just some really interesting research about like where do we stand in the field of curriculum-based professional learning. And so this is the reason, kind of the catalyst for them joining us today. And so I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to Molly so that she can share more about their study, why did they conduct it, and what did they find. So Molly, take it away.
Thanks so much, Annie. Really appreciate it. Just a quick word on CPRL. The Center for Public Research and Leadership, CPRL, are located at Columbia University. We bring together graduate students from all across the country, law school students, business school students, public policy school students, education graduate school students, data science graduate school students, and a few other disciplines as well. And they join us at Columbia for a semester where they take a seminar and a skills course that are designed to give them the sort of ways of thinking and ways of working about advancing equity in K-12 education that we think are really necessary and critical for them to be leaders in education one day. And they work on real projects for real clients. And so we partner with a number of different kinds of organizations in the K-12 education space. We work with school districts, state departments of education, nonprofits, advocacy organizations, philanthropies, and others on mission critical projects, research projects, legal projects, advocacy projects, measurement projects, strategy projects, and the like. Again, all really focused on promoting greater equity, better experiences, better outcomes for kids in K-12 education. And so Grace, Liz, and I and our colleagues have the privilege of working alongside our teams of graduate students and our wonderful clients and partners on these projects every semester. This paper was the result of work on one of those projects. So we're really eager to share with you more about how it came to be, what we did, and what we learned. With that, let me tell you a little bit about the research questions. So what we know in our work with a number of different kinds of organizations in K-12 education, and in particular those who are thinking a lot about high quality instructional materials and aligned professional learning as a way to advance better teaching and better learning for kids, is that there's a lot of talk of this idea of fields. We need a field. We need to advance the field. We need to make the field stronger. And it can be really hard to figure out actually what it is we're talking about when we say a field and the need to develop it. And so using the Bridgespan Group's framework, Field Building for Population Level Change, we endeavored to both define and better understand the nature of this particular field, curriculum-based professional learning. And in that work, we explored 4 primary research questions that you can see are up on the slide here. But essentially what we sought to understand was how well developed is the field of curriculum-based professional learning, examining in particular the 5 observable characteristics that Bridgespan provides as evidence of the development of a field, and what does the field need to do in order to get stronger and to deepen its impact across K-12 education in this country, and what are the barriers that it may face along the way. We also used as like a really essential piece of literature and a way of understanding the framework of curriculum-based professional learning, what at the time was a challenge paper and now is actually a book called The Elements, which provides a really useful sort of framework and way of understanding what curriculum-based professional learning is and sort of what it could be. And so that was essential to our research, and you'll see it listed there in the 4th research question as we sought to understand the extent to which there was alignment between what is provided for in the Elements framework and what is actually happening in the field. So with that, over the course of about 6 months, we engaged in a study that included 2 phases. The first was looking at a number of secondary sources, including foundation giving, publicly available information about the extent to which philanthropic organizations are providing funding to curriculum-based professional learning. We looked at ESSA and ESSER plans. We looked at state standards, professional learning websites, professional learning provider lists, including those included or sort of compiled by Rivet Education. And we looked at both the RAND AIRS data from the last 3 years and publicly available the survey instruments themselves in order to understand the kinds of things that researchers were seeking to learn and better understand about the field of curriculum-based professional learning. So that was phase one. And then in phase two, we had a whole bunch of conversations with a whole bunch of really well-informed experts in this field. And so we talked to a number of different kinds of folks. We talked to leaders at the school level. We talked to leaders at the district level. We spoke with professional learning organizations that sit both sort of external to schools and districts and those that sit within schools and districts. We talked to philanthropists. We talked to researchers and a number of folks that work in sort of regional education agencies that go by all sorts of different acronyms that I'm sure some folks on this call know far better than I do. But we tried to ensure that what we were learning was sort of as nationally representative as we could get it, both by talking to people that spanned various kinds of systems and schools that sit in various demographic and geographic regions within the country. And we tried to ensure that the folks that we were talking to really ran the gamut in terms of the altitude at which they interacted with this work in order to get a good sense of sort of what was happening and the state of the field and sort of what needed to happen in order for it to grow. So using all of those data sources, we then applied the analytic framework that's provided for in Bridgespan Group's field building for population level change document. And so the way that they think about fields and their progression over time is that they advance on a continuum that begins with emerging fields where impact is sort of scattered and sporadic and only sort of pieces or fractions of the problem being solved, to forming where impact is becoming more consistent as infrastructure and collaboration and coordination are sort of accelerating and starting to amplify the progress that's being made. And then over time, what Bridgespan provides for is that fields become what they call evolving and sustaining, where impact is accelerating at a pretty rapid clip, and it's occurring at something much closer to the scale that is sought by the field. And so this is the analytical framework that we applied as we engaged in our research. The other thing that I mentioned before, and now we'll talk through in a bit more detail, are the 5 observable characteristics that Bridgespan provides for in its framework and that we see as like a really helpful, I think it's a really helpful asset-based way of thinking about fields and their development over time. And so what we do is we look at all of the evidence, both secondary and primary evidence that we collected over the course of our research and examined it through the lens of these 5 observable characteristics. And so we looked at the field level agenda, the actors, the knowledge base, the infrastructure, and the resources in order to analyze where on each of these observable characteristics it appeared that the field was. That in turn helped us identify sort of the areas of relative strength and the areas of real opportunity for further growth, deepening, and expansion of the field and the work that the field actors and others are sort of already engaging in. And so if you're interested in learning about the detailed version of our analysis on each of these 5 observable characteristics, I would strongly encourage you to read the paper where we go into it at pretty significant detail. I will not sort of walk through each of these 5 observable characteristics today because it is all there in the paper and makes for a really great read. And I think that for today's conversation, perhaps what's most sort of like helpful or informative for you all is the recommendations that resulted from the analysis that we engaged in from these 5 observable characteristics and the larger field development framework. And so let me talk through the recommendations and then really eager to get your all's thoughts and questions. And Liz, Grace, and I will all be happy to answer them. The first recommendation is really around knowledge generation. We called it knowledge generation, application, and improvement. And the idea here really is that there's a lot of really powerful, really exceptional work happening in the field of curriculum-based professional learning. And as the field seeks to grow, deepen, and scale all its effort, there's like a lot that needs to be captured in order to ensure that scaling happens at a high degree of quality consistently across the field. And as I'm sure folks on this call can appreciate perhaps better than most, that's a really difficult endeavor to engage in, and it requires sort of strengthening the knowledge base that underpins the work that's happening in order to make sure that it's harnessed and it's applied really consistently across the field. And so when we think about knowledge generation, while certainly we think about using sort of effective tools and other mechanisms for generating the knowledge, it even more so in this context, we think, is about sort of deepening the field's understanding of how to act upon the knowledge that exists and how to apply what we know about how to effectively engage in curriculum-based professional learning in ways that are consistent and sort of scalable across a pretty expansive field. So that is really what we think about and sort of learned about knowledge generation. The other thing that we'll say is one of the things that I think makes knowledge generation itself, and certainly the accessing and application of knowledge really difficult, is that the language that's currently used in the field isn't that specific or sort of like there's not like a common set of language that gets used across. And so one example there of what we heard is some folks would call what we used as in the paper as curriculum-based professional learning, we heard it called standards-aligned professional learning. We heard it called high-quality professional learning. We heard it called HQIM professional learning, and a variety of other terms as well. And what we realized, both in our conversations and when we were engaging in our own sort of literature review and trying to understand the nature of the research base that underpins this field, is that there are a lot of terms that are used to describe this kind of work. And what we've found is that actually sometimes would get in the way of people thinking that they were a part of the field and people accessing the information that existed about the field and thinking about themselves as part of the field, right? And so that will be another area where it feels like there are sort of interesting opportunities for further development as the field grows. When we think about coalition on-ramps and collaboration, I think that what we noticed, especially in our analysis of the observable characteristic that's focused on key actors, is that there's a lot of really strong key actors that are highly visible and deeply entrenched in this work. And there's a lot of people that are sort of like just on the periphery of the field, such that they are really well aligned in the way that they're thinking and often in the way that they're working with the work of curriculum-based professional learning, but they're sort of like just on the cusp of the field, and they aren't engaging or having sort of the kinds of strong, deep interactions that you would expect to have among key actors. And so it felt like there were these opportunities to engage these folks that we kept saying like, oh, they're just on the periphery of this. Like, we just got to get them in a little bit tighter, and they would be deeply part of this this movement, this field. And so that is like one really interesting takeaway, is sort of thinking about how the field can more deeply build coalitions and create on-ramps for these folks. I think the other things that we noticed about the field as we engaged in our research are that there were a few types of so I would describe them as sort of like categories of people that feel like they could be more effectively enveloped into the work that's happening. One is school leadership. We heard very consistently across the different kinds of folks that we talked to that there is and continues to be a really deep need to engage school leadership in this work, and to more effectively sort of define the role of school leaders in curriculum-based professional learning, figure out how and at what level of granularity they need to be provided with information that they can use to support the work of curriculum-based professional learning, and really just to be very mindful of the role, the really powerful role that they play in curriculum-based professional learning, and whether it will be a success or be sort of like a passing fad as we continue on in our work within the field. The other place that it feels like there really is a pretty deep opportunity to engage folks is sort of like those who are often considered I think what I would describe as like beneficiaries of curriculum-based professional learning, teachers, students, and families. But typically what we found in our research is that those folks were sort of considered beneficiaries and nothing more. They weren't as involved in setting the field level agenda. They weren't considered key actors in the way that you might expect, given how deeply affected they are by the work. And it felt like there too, there are opportunities to really think intentionally as a field about what it would look like to meaningfully include teachers, students, and families, not only as sort of like the recipients and the beneficiaries of the work, but as the drivers of the work. And one more thing I'll say there is, as we think about sort of their role in drivers, I think there is something also really powerful and important about the fact that they are essential to ensuring that the work can continue in longevity. And so there's also something really powerful in particular about that group, as well as school leaders, that we found in the research, where including them in this work and having them be really strong key actors provides curriculum-based professional learning with opportunities and the strength that it will need in order to have the deep commitment and buy-in that it requires, given sort of how long and messy and arduous the actual work can be. And then the last thing that I'll share about our recommendations is related to that point, which is about long-term resources and time that are required. I think we heard sort of resoundingly across the board over the course of our research sort of how essential it is to invest in this work for the long term, that it takes a long time, it is hard, it is messy, it is complex. It cannot be sort of distilled down into deliverables that get created after 6 months. It's not that kind of work. And again, I'm sure everyone on this call could attest to the fact that the need to commit to sort of the long game in this is real. And if the field is going to continue to grow and scale and deepen, really like meaningfully deepen and become sort of like the entrenched way that professional learning happens in education, it's going to require significant resources and long-term investment. The other thing that we heard is the issue of time, right? Like I think across the board, there was a sentiment expressed that teachers, school leaders, and others only have so much time in their day, in their week, in their month, in their year. And what that means is that when they are engaging in work around curriculum-based professional learning, it is at the expense of something else. And so thinking about what it looks like to reconceptualize, reorganize the work of teachers in order to make space and make time for curriculum-based professional learning, and in order to ensure that it can be sort of effectively folded into the work of teachers is really essential. And then the last thing I would say is just thinking about economies of scale, given sort of like the intensity required in terms of time and resources that curriculum-based professional learning demands. Thinking about how to support cross-district, cross-school collaboration feels really important. That became especially apparent when we thought about and talked to folks who worked with rural and smaller districts, where there wasn't the same sort of capacity or even the same number of people teaching a particular grade or subject area or curriculum, such that you would need to look beyond sort of the confines of the school building in order to engage in the kind of work that curriculum-based professional learning necessitates. So that was a lot of talking from me. I will now stop talking. Hopefully that was a helpful overview. If you are interested in learning more, please do read the paper. And Liz, Grace, and I are happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Molly, for that really helpful overview. Of course, like so many of the recommendations you have here are things that like Rivet is naturally thinking about on a day-to-day basis. Some of these things are things that keep us up at night. But I know that I wanted to also share, because I know many of you that are joining us today are our PL providers that are featured in the Professional Learning Partner Guide, as well as some of our SCA partners. And so the blog post that I wrote for October takes a look at these recommendations and breaks them down, specifically looking at those recommendations for PL organizations and SEAs. And so I'm dropping a link to that in the chat for those of you all that may be interested in taking a look at those specific recommendations. Again, those recommendations are in the report itself. And so, yeah, but that's so helpful. I think I have a ton of questions for you guys. So Tigger, if you don't mind just like stopping sharing the screen for a minute, just so I can, there we go, so I can see the team. I have questions for you all, but I know that those of you, our guests on the call today, may also have questions. So just a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and we will get to them in a minute. But my question for you all is, like, before we even dig into some of my questions about the research, is why, you talked a lot just now, Molly, about the field, right? And like looking at like, what is the field of curriculum-based professional learning? And so my question first is just like, why study a field development? Like, how did you even start there? And also, like, why are you using the Bridgespan framework in particular here to do this study?
I can go for it, Annie. So
Yeah,
it's a great question. So for us, studying this work at the field level is really key, because I think, as Molly alluded to, as she was sort of describing the research more broadly, this broader effort to make sure that students have equitable access to grade level, rigorous instruction is just such an enormous task. It's impossible to think that one organization or one district, one state even could accomplish it, on their own. And so we think that it's really important to sort of start at the field level, because we really want to see how those different actors, when coordinated, when linked, when sharing resources, can really catalyze a broader impact. So that's sort of the why a field. But I think the other question is, why Bridgespan, why this particular framework? And there, I feel like I can't resist telling this little self-deprecating story. But when Liz first told us, hey, we're going to be working on exploring the field of curriculum-based professional learning, first thing that came to mind for me was, well, what really is a field? That's such an abstract term. I think when I think about curriculum-based professional learning, sure, there are lots of really incredible actors that come to mind, and folks that we've had the chance to work with through CPRL, but I think, what really is a field? So I think what I personally like a lot about the Bridgespan framework, and I think others would probably agree, is just the fact that it roots the idea of a field and understanding its progress in stuff that's really observable. So they start with those 5 observable characteristics. And for me, it just makes it really concrete to think, where is this field in terms of its development, and where do we need to go in order to advance the work? So Molly talked through them, but just for the sake of folks who might be joining, those 5 characteristics are, first, a field level agenda, sort of a set of activities that the actors are working toward. The actors themselves, of course, and those are the folks who are sort of setting the agenda, carrying out those key activities. The knowledge base, which Molly walked through as well, the research that supports the work, the infrastructure, which refers to some of the tools and connections that exist within the field. And then, of course, we've got, oh my gosh, yes, our knowledge base, our field level agenda, our infrastructure, our research, and what's the last one?
Resources.
Goodness gracious, our resources, of course. And there, with resources, we're thinking about both the financial resources and the non-financial resources. So I think the broader point, though, is that it really does make it quite concrete to sort of understand this broad work, which can sometimes feel a bit intangible.
Yeah, I really appreciated the Bridgespan framework. I know Jim Short has mentioned it to us a couple of times in just like different conversations, but this was like the first opportunity I had to like really dig into it. And so, it's like, the saying, it really does take a village. And I think like this like field framework does like establish like who all has a role, or what all has a role in the village. So my next question to you all is then like, why this particular piece of research? So like, why study curriculum-based professional learning? Like, what was the catalyst for you all saying like, oh, this is something we should like get a deeper look into?
I'm happy to get started. I think so. One of the reasons why we're really interested in curriculum-based professional learning specifically is because because we are always trying to figure out how systems can improve to best meet the needs of whoever they're serving. And we focus on the public sector and public education specifically. And so for a long time, one of our focuses has been around how the adults who are in schools come together to learn in order to serve their kids and families and communities as best as they can, and in ways that are best suited to each particular child, family, and community's needs. And it's if you're interested in those types of things, as you well know at Rivet, then that just brings up professional learning. And I think it brings up this idea of not just adding in new opportunities, but rethinking the role of educators, how they come together to do their work individually and collectively. And so we've been very focused on curriculum-based professional learning, and it's our focus has only increased as we've learned more about the curriculum piece, because one of the things that we think is really crucial about curriculum is that when it is shared and of high quality, it allows for more productive collaborative spaces. So that's a little bit about our interest in curriculum-based professional learning, and then why pair that with a field level analysis. I think one of the things that we've started to see is that there is enough interest by actors. And in the analysis itself, you saw that, you see this in the field level agenda and in the infrastructure, to start to think about, is there more that can be done if people band together than if everyone's just figuring out how to move along in their own lane? And is it time to start an assessment of what's happening at the field level so that we can set a baseline and be more strategic about those efforts that might be boundary crossing, both in terms of organizations, but also in terms of types of organizations. And so for that reason, we're hoping to put this out so that those of us who might consider ourselves kind of field builders as a secondary identity might think of it more as a primary identity, and really think about how we can catalyze the growth of this really important work.
Great, thanks, Liz. And so I think for me, knowing that Rivet, works most closely with SEAs in our consulting work with all of our different state partners that we work with to, again, help them scale curriculum-based professional learning in their states. And then also with all of the organizations, publishers, and PL providers alike that we work with on the Professional Learning Partner Guide, I think, like our blog post, I wanted to dig into today some of the recommendations that you all outlined in the report specific to SEA leaders and PL organizations. Most importantly, because there's a lot of recommendations in here about how they should be working together to build the field of curriculum-based professional learning. And so one of the recommendations that you all had for SEAs and PL providers is to prioritize school leadership. So Molly, you talked about this, and we loved seeing this recommendation because we see firsthand in our work the importance of how school systems are involving their school leaders in the implementation of high quality instruction materials. The extent to which they are involved can make or break the success of that new curriculum. And so we love seeing that called out specifically in the report. And so can you just share some specifics from the study regarding the role of school leaders in curriculum-based professional learning, and what did you see to lead you all to calling out that recommendation in particular? And then what are some of the specific recommendations you might have for our SEA partners and PL orgs on the call today on how they can best involve school leaders in this work?
Yeah, absolutely. This is such an important piece of the work, Annie. And I think just to sort of start with what we did learn in the research and what we heard was, as I think Molly already started to explain a bit, that school leaders are sometimes not thought of as field actors, and they're not necessarily provided with the curriculum-based professional learning support that we know is going out to lots of educators. So, in fact, over the course of the research, it was clear to us that there's a ton of attention being paid by districts at the strategy development level. And there's also a ton of focus on getting professional learning out to teachers. But sometimes, principals, they get left out of the equation. And, on the one hand, this is it comes as a bit of a less of surprising finding, I suppose, given that, at least over the last 3 years, and it's always been true that principals wear, a ton of different hats at once. But especially over the last couple of years, it's just been, additional work stream after additional operational work stream associated with the pandemic and making sure that, kids and families' needs are met there. But as you've said, we've also heard from folks on the ground that without the principal investment in both, implementation of high quality instructional materials and in the associated professional learning structures, it's really hard to get the kind of traction that folks really want to see. So they're just essential to providing the vision and the support that's needed. And then when it comes to, PL providers and to SEAs, I think that it's really important just to start with defining the role that we want to see principals play in all of this. I think that that's a place where there's been a lack of clarity, or at least that's what surfaced in our research. And, whether it looks like setting the vision alongside folks at the district level or alongside other principals within a given district, whether it has to do with providing professional learning that is focused on setting up school level structures to support this kind of work. That's something that we have often found is missing at the school level. Whether it has to do with supporting those leaders to pull together the kinds of resources that they need. I think it really starts with defining the role and then providing the supports that are needed so that folks can carry that role out. Molly or Liz, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that. I know this was a really important piece of the work. I guess that's a no. Back to you, Annie.
Yeah, and Grace, I think, for us at Rivet, I think this is like when we are evaluating professional learning organizations and their services for the PLPG, we look at like 4 types of curriculum-based professional learning: adoption, launch, ongoing support for teachers. And this 4th bucket is system design and leadership support, and we pull that piece off, on its own because we think we value it that much. And so I think, you touched on a bunch of points of like, it is like helping them assess their systems, their structures, like what are the enabling conditions you're creating in schools to support the implementation of high quality instruction materials. But I think also like one of the biggest pieces that we see overlooked is like involving principals in that initial launch training alongside their teachers. Like just as much as teachers need to be bought in and understand the why, like the design, the approach, the structure of their curriculum, leaders need that too. They need to understand that just as much as their teachers do, because when their teachers start to struggle, like that leader needs to believe and trust those materials and be able to coach those teachers and like help them bring them along. Because if they don't believe in their materials, they're gonna be like, yeah, just go back to doing what you were doing. Go back to teachers pay teachers. Go back to like your own lesson planning. They're going to give up on it just as easily as the teachers will if they don't have that buy-in. And so, we want to see like they need to be involved very early. And like you said, even from the vision setting, like when we look at like math, involve your leaders in setting that vision, right? Like that should not happen in isolation at the district level. And then make sure they're getting that initial and that ongoing support, which is what our PL providers here are so skilled at doing. So yes, preach, I'm all on board. So another recommendation that we just loved seeing in there was to commit to the long game. This is a marathon of work. I don't no truer words have ever been spoken of when I saw that in the report, that this is not something that is going to happen overnight. And that's a struggle for us, right? We live in this immediate gratification society of we want to see results now. And we see that with schools and school systems. They're just often they underestimate the volume and duration of work that that implementing a curriculum and the curriculum-based professional learning that comes behind it is going to be needed to really see the payoff for teachers and leaders. When we talk with folks, we're like, don't worry about student results for about 3 years. That is a hard thing to to accept, right? But it's you need to set those expectations, set it with your school board, set it with your, it is a long game. And you'll see other types of results, almost initially, but those like big long-term changes in student test scores results do take time to achieve. And so I was just wondering if like you all can like talk on some of your recommendations for both SEAs and PL providers to help like them have these conversations, right, with school leaders or teachers who are wanting to see those more immediate results. Like, what are some of the things that you all can recommend to help them and help their school systems make these like long-term investments in curriculum-based professional learning?
It's such a great question, Annie. And I think embedded in your voiceover of why this is important is one of the key ideas, which is this is a change management process. And in virtually every place that we have been working in, either for this study or for one of the many other studies that we've conducted in this space, anyone who views this as an kind of an add-on intervention ultimately doesn't succeed. And so committing to the long game means that you're realizing that this is a change process that requires change at every level of the system, and that it does change how people work at every level of the system, because you're creating, building, improving upon, and sustaining learning systems when you engage in curriculum-based professional learning. And so a few specific recommendations in that. One is to engage in the change process. And that means that it typically doesn't work if you think about it just coming down as a top-down directive, which I'm sure all of the state leaders know who are on the call today. It means that you need to engage the people who are working at the ground level, the people who are working at the school administrator, district administrator, and state level, to ensure that there's system level coherence around this major change and investment. It means that you need to think about kids, families, and communities in the work, the places that we've seen sustain the change, see the opportunity and the value to bring a lot of people into the learning process. And like I said earlier, see curriculum as an enabler of collaboration. It's an enabler of learning. It's an enabler of crossing boundaries and getting more people into that instructional process. And then the last thing I'll say quickly is a focus on quality, which is another place that Rivet really comes in here. And what we've heard from system after system after system is that when the work is high quality, people get really excited by it. And it's one of the reasons why I think the work that you all put out is so important, is because one of the questions that we get a lot is, where do I go for high quality work? Because our teachers are tired of, the reform churn. And so is this really going to be something that makes a difference for kids? And to your point, even if there's a lag in student outcomes, our teachers are smart and committed people, and they are pretty quick at picking up when the work that they're engaged in makes a day-to-day difference for their kids, even if they're not seeing it in, state assessments results the next year in particular. And so that quality piece matters so much. And in many cases matters as much, if not more, than kind of the scale at which you roll it out the first go round.
Yep, absolutely. And I think this is like one of our big lessons too, coming out of both Litzy and I, coming from Louisiana and our work, that, Louisiana was one of the first states to really invest at scale in scaling the use of high quality instruction materials, is that, it does take, it takes a while to see the growth, and it takes an investment from like multiple fronts. So yeah, I think it's, again, one of my more favorite recommendations from the report. The other recommendation I would love to dig in with you guys is, as the use of high quality instruction materials grows, and what you all have identified as like the emerging field of curriculum-based professional learning grows, and we're starting to see a little bit of this already, PL providers and SEAs are going to struggle to meet district demand for curriculum-based professional learning. While that is a great problem to have, it's a problem, right? Nonetheless. And so what recommendations do you all have, and this may be more so on the SEA front, but maybe for PL providers as well, of like how to best expand their capacity to support school systems in using curriculum-based professional learning, or providing curriculum-based professional learning to teachers and leaders?
Yeah, Annie, I'm happy to at least start speaking to that. I think that there are two things that come to mind when thinking about this question of capacity. Or maybe three, but at least two. I think that there's one, it sort of goes back to what we spoke to earlier about this idea of there being various kinds of organizations that are really sitting on the periphery of this work right now, but are very closely aligned and sometimes have like pretty significant scale that's already built into their work. And so I think that there are really interesting opportunities for partnership, for collaboration, for mutual learning in order to sort of help the field scale by widening the tent of people who are actually engaged in and committed to this kind of work. And because what we realized in the course of our research, that there are these like organizations sort of like at the ready to take up this work and to be to participate in the carrying of it forward. It feels like this idea of like collaboration feels like a really powerful one to think about scaling. I think that there's also, you sort of referenced this in your question, Annie, but there's like something really deep and important and powerful about capacity building within school buildings and systems, so that we think about our external PL providers as partners in the work that are, sort of like there. And we see some PL providers actually use this model where like the whole point is that then they don't have to be there anymore because they've equipped the folks at the school level, teachers, teacher leaders, coaches, school leaders, et cetera, with the skills, the knowledge, the mindsets that they need in order to engage in the work and to be sort of like self-sufficient in the way that they're engaging in continued ongoing curriculum-based professional learning. And so that I think is like a really important additional piece that I would comment on.
Yeah, and we saw this in our market research that we did recently around professional learning, in that this is a fear that like school and district leaders have. They have this fear of, one, partnering with someone that like at the end of the day is not going to be great because they've had these experiences before, which again is one of the ways that the professional learning partner guide, we're trying to solve for that problem by pointing them to vetted, proven providers. But another fear that they have is like this, like being like a partner in perpetuity and just like sucking the life out of their budget year after year, right? And this is a real fear that they have. And so, I think one of the ways that Rivet tries to help solve for this is we ask the PL providers in the PLPG, like on their profiles, one of the questions we ask is like, how do you build this capacity within a district to basically like work yourself out of a contract? Because that should be the end goal. There should be some sort of gradual release plan that is in place to build that local capacity just to be able to support and stand on their own, their materials, right? And so I think that's one that like we feel at Rivet, like we should be putting healthy pressure on PL providers to do that work, and that they shouldn't be there till the end of time in a contract with districts. It should be like a process to, again, work themselves out of that contract. So I think that's like really helpful. I think too is like helping SEAs understand the value of their local providers too, like their local, you mentioned it earlier, they're called all different things in different states. You have ESUs or CISAs or RISAs or whatever they may be, these like regional support centers who are already in a position of providing curriculum-based professional learning to educators. And so one of the things that Rivet's trying to do is like help some of our state partners figure out like, how do you shift their focus to curriculum-based professional learning? And that takes time. We recognize that, right? It takes a long time to understand like, what is curriculum-based professional learning and how do I provide it? And what are some of those fundamental shifts in teacher practice that these new high quality materials really require that I have to then account for in my services? But I think that's an important thing too, to help state agencies. It's like, how do you leverage that local support that's already in place? They already have trust with your districts. They've built that trust over many, many years. So how do you leverage them as well? So I guess my last question is kind of a selfish one. And so, spent a lot of time talking about recommendations for SEAs and PL partners, but, naturally Rivet has a sense of ownership in this work, you know, and as, you know, one of the players in the infrastructure piece of curriculum-based professional learning and also in the resources. And so I'd love to know, like, what recommendations do you all have for us as a key player in the field of curriculum-based professional learning? What are some things that we can be doing so we're not staying, to your point earlier, Molly, about, or actually, Liz, you said this, in our own lane, right? Like, what are ways in which we can help build the field in partnership with PL providers and SEAs?
Well, you predicted exactly where I was going to start. No surprise, Annie. But yeah, I think one of the things that we've been encouraging folks who are so passionate about the work to do, and who are people like you, and you're already spanning lots of different organizations with your one organization's effort, is to really embrace the identity of a field catalyst and think about what that means for you. I think so often it is the case that we look to people who have financial resources to be those field catalysts. And it might be that this field is at a time where more people should assume that identity, because there are lots of other resources beyond financial ones that are going to make a real difference here. And I think Rivet is the perfect type of organization to kind of claim that identity and move forward as such, and help others see the ways that they can do work that affects the growth of the field beyond the activities that they're directly engaged with. One of the things that we already discussed with the recommendations that I think you could really take ownership of in even bigger and more serious ways that you already have, because everyone seems to appreciate it to such a great extent, is the fact that you are a discerner of quality, and you're able to show people where they can really get high quality services that will be well matched to their context. And we've heard time and time again a lot of appreciation for that from the field, and eagerness for you to do that even more. And then the last thing I would say is, to a point that Molly made very early on, there are a bunch of people who are so close to being part of this field, but for one kind of minor reason or another have yet to see their identity in it, and then assume it's, you know, they're not part of the crowd. They're out there while all of you are in here. And I think there are ways, given kind of your higher level seat, and seeing across organizations, that you can help bring others into the fold and help people see themselves in the work that you're supporting and moving forward.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Liz. I appreciate that. I think, you know, again, we have to hold ourselves accountable to building the field of CBPL as well. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to shift real quick because I know we're like running close to time. So I'm going to look in the Q&A. Again, if you have questions, drop them in here, but we do have a couple that I'll just voice them out loud. The three of y'all decide who wants to field it. But more of like a comment, just would love to hear more on thoughts on fidelity versus integrity. I know there's a section in the paper about that, but would love to hear more, or an expansion or elaboration on that issue. Like, what were some of the key aspects, limitations, potential next steps around that particular point?
Yeah, so it's a really wonderful question. And I think that the place where it came up is in the context of the field level agenda, right? And so when we think about a field level agenda and how it's developing as a field becomes more advanced, what we see is that there is sort of like a coalescing around, or sort of like agreement around central tenets to whatever the field is trying to achieve. And what we see is that really strong fields can also have areas where there is like healthy different viewpoints, like disagreement within the field about what the field is seeking to achieve. And what we noticed in the context of this research for this field is that there were a whole bunch of different kinds of questions about the field and what it was seeking to pursue and the methods by which it was seeking to pursue that, where there was sort of like disagreement or not yet a coalescing around a particular approach or strategy or even goal. the fidelity versus integrity question was one of those places where essentially when we engaged in our interviews with various people, like people just had different opinions. Some people thought that the point of curriculum-based professional learning, its goal was to equip teachers with what they need to teach with integrity. Others thought that it was to equip teachers to teach the curriculum with what people call integrity, adapting it, you know, to meet the needs of their context and their students. And then some people thought that it was actually part of like a continuum where you wanted to get teachers to be able to teach it with fidelity so that then over time they could teach it with integrity, right? And so there was just like a real mix of opinions on this particular topic alongside a few, like a healthy handful, I would say, of other topics around what the duration should be and when it should happen and sort of like the mechanics of how it happens. And so what we revealed through this, or I think what was revealed to us through this research, is that there are all these like different topics, these like areas where there's not yet agreement in the field. And I think that the question for the field, and it's a difficult one, I think, is like which of those topics sort of like can remain unanswered or sort of like have multiple views and multiple answers and still allow for the field's continued growth and development, and which feel like they really are rate limiting steps where until the field gets clearer and coalesces around a particular view on the question, it's going to stymie the field's ability to grow and improve. And so when we talked about fidelity versus integrity, it was one of those things where I think we as CPRL, right, like we didn't have an opinion on the topic, but we noticed that it was one of these areas where the field level agenda has not yet developed a strong unified viewpoint. And maybe that's fine for the field's continued growth and improvement, but it was like an interesting observation that we made.
Yeah, I think we've seen similar observations in our work too, that the where, when, how matter less than the what and the why, right? Like what is happening in the PL, whether it's happening in a coaching session or a PLC or a workshop, matters. Like the quality of that what, and you know, what teachers are engaging and our leaders are engaging matters more than anything, because we've seen that like really great PL can happen once a month and that be enough, right? Or it can happen weekly. And that's, you know, I think there's just like a lot of like local context that matters there in deciding how often and what structure. But it's more about like what is happening during that professional learning. And to be honest, most of the times it should be curriculum based, right? And so I think that, you know, for us is like one of the most important factors is that the PL is grounded in the materials that teachers are using every single day. So you're not making them do the hard work of like taking this isolated strategy and then trying to fit it into their materials within the context of their materials. Like that is hard work. Teachers' jobs are hard enough as it is. So yeah, I see that. I know we are close at time. There was one other question I wanted that we got actually in the chat, which was that one of our PL partners was, saying that like when we were talking about the gradual release and, building local capacity, is that like real budget constraints, like often result in like districts kind of like purchasing the bare minimum, right? Like just enough to get by, which at the end of the day is like not what is best for teachers to change teacher practice or to skillfully use a curriculum. And so their question was like, are you all aware of any funding sources that are really going to start focusing on curriculum-based professional learning? Because I know you all talked to several funders as part of this research. I know there's like some, organizations or foundations that are already investing in this work in some ways. And so if y'all could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's a big question to answer in 1 minute, but a few very quick thoughts is one, I don't know that there are going to be any large new pools of money that are large enough to meet the scale that are going to be unlocked particular to this body of work. And so a lot of our work has been thinking about how do you take advantage of existing funds and make sure that they're supportive and used so that you are delivering on the strategies that matter most for kids. And so it's really about efficient, effective, and often creative allocation of dollars and accessing of dollars to make this work happen and to spread it. And I know that's a lot of the work that the CCSSO network has been doing to encourage states and localities to figure out how to use dollars and use the ones that exist as incentives. There are a number of funders who are active in this area. And we've also had a number of conversations around how to take advantage of the stimulus funds to do the same thing that you might do with the ongoing resources. And then the last thing I'll say is this is where some of those, like bringing more people into the tent, could help, because we've had folks who are starting to rethink how to engage, some of their regional service providers and others, unions and other things that might not be as explicitly focused on this work, but actually quite aligned in what they're trying to do, that have resources that can be used in service of this type of strategy.
Yep. Thanks, Liz. Ladies, I know we're at time today. Again, thank you both, all three of you so much, not only for conducting this research in the first place, but for joining us today. And as a reminder, we are going to share out like a link to the recording from this webinar, as well as the presentation, and then obviously a direct link to y'all's study itself. But thank y'all so much for joining us. I hope everyone got a lot out of this conversation today. And we look forward to seeing y'all in November for our Professional Learning Power Hour, where we'll sit down with instruction partners and take a look at some of their new resources around running effective professional learning communities. Until then, hope everyone has a great day and the rest of their week. Bye.